Welcome to this short podcast on reimagining the workforce of the future after COVID-19 and why it's important for HR leadership to get started on this journey. This podcast will be focused on why it's important and how to get started. In the next podcast we plan in the three-part series, we'll talk about going deeper on case studies and tools. And then last, delivering those all-important results. But before we get started today, Martin, how are you doing? Introduce yourself if you would, please.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks a lot for asking. I'm doing fine. We are staying at home like everybody else. We are doing homeschool. We are baking bread and we're playing table tennis in the living room. But honestly, we're doing really fine. And just to introduce myself, I'm a global HR leader, having worked for IBM and Schneider Electric. I've been the head of HR for a global business unit, and I've also led a number of center of expertise, such as strategic workforce planning, learning and development, and also workforce management. Jennifer, how are you doing?
Well, fine. I'm like your family and many others out there. Distance learning, in this case, a Waldorf student who's 8, and we don't use media, so that's a bit of a challenge. Clearly, cleaning, cooking more than I would like to, and also honing my skills on remote working and virtual meetings with clients. My background is in corporate technology companies like yours, with companies like Synopsys, Logitech, Seagate, KLA-Tencor, in senior leadership positions, global HR, as well as total rewards and workforce planning. Over the last few years, I've been building a consulting business on really helping companies build the infrastructure that they need to support their business strategy. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about one such example. But before we do, I'd like to ask you, Martin, why is it important for HR to get started on reimagining the future workforce?
I think that is a very fair question. Organizations are dealing with some enormous challenges right now, and they have to think about how have the customer needs changed. They have to look after their financial situation right now. They deal with the supply chain, how to work with business partners, and of course, they also have some significant people challenges. That said, there are organizations out there leading the way with some good practices. They are obviously concentrating on resolving the current challenges, but they're also starting to think ahead. There are lots of materials out there from different thought leaders on this topic, on how to lead into the new normal. If you look at those different materials and you try to summarize it in simple terms, I think there are 3 spheres. It's about solving the current challenges, as mentioned before. It's about preparing the return, getting ready for the return. And it is then really to strategically thinking about the future and how the organization will position themselves for the future. Jennifer, what are you hearing from the companies that you are seeing?
The companies I've been talking with, of course, fall into the 2 camps of essential industries and workers and non-essential, with obvious ramifications for hiring and for laying off and furloughs. An impact, of course, on compliance with federal and state and even city compliance requirements for leaves, etc. So at this time, I think we have to kind of start to think a little out of the weeds, if you will, about preparing for the return. And it's not just about how we return, but it's also about how HR gets started on getting engaged in defining who returns and shapes the future workforce. Martin, how do you get started on this journey?
The organizations that I see that are looking ahead are creating dedicated teams. Those are cross-functional teams who get together to really focus on the future. They do scenario planning. They typically go through a number of critical questions for their organizations and their business. And they will look at how and when will the economy recover, how is the political, social context evolving, what will happen to their markets, what are the competitors doing, how will customer needs change, and obviously how will we as an organization position ourselves in that new market, in that new context. I think for HR it is important to be involved and participate early in those discussions as a participant, to give the inputs that HR can bring to the table. HR should also obviously lead the people dimension, the discussion from a people point of view. HR needs to evaluate what is going to change for the workforce, what is not going to change for the workforce, and bring in those point of views, develop an HR strategy for the different scenarios, and really think through how is our workforce going to evolve. What does a competent workforce look like? A resilient and agile workforce, an engaged and motivated workforce responding again to those different scenarios.
Right. And you have a great example of how a 150,000 employee tech company, Schneider Electric, came out of the Great Recession of 2008. Right, Martin?
Yes, I've been on an exciting journey with Schneider Electric. After the financial crisis, Schneider Electric came out and took the opportunity to rethink their business strategy. Until then, they were a successful product and hardware company, and they decided to change their value proposition to their customers to be more of a solutions company with software and services offerings. They could see with that new strategy that they needed to significantly evolve their workforce. So an important dimension of that transformation was to develop strategic workforce plans for those new business strategies. That's when I came in and I had the opportunity to build a practice and a method around strategic workforce planning to help Schneider Electric with doing exactly that. We developed both strategic workforce plans at the macro level to see how the workforce overall would be evolving at the group level, but also at the micro level, where we worked country by country, business unit by business unit, function by function, to look at the transformation, each of the strategies, and translate those into strategic workforce plans. There was a financial dimension to our strategic workforce plans, looking at headcount, labor cost, workforce productivity, and so forth. But obviously also we had a strategic perspective here, where we went into each strategic initiative to look at how would we design the appropriate organizations to deliver on those strategic initiatives? What were the critical roles? What were the critical competencies to really execute on those strategic initiatives? I have a lot of lessons learned from doing strategic workforce planning with Schneider. One of the positive lessons learned for sure was that we really did the workforce planning as cross-functional teams, where we were involving strategy, finance, HR, and the business leaders to sit around the table, not owned by HR, but really a team effort to look at the business strategy and the implications for the workforce. Something that I think we could have improved were we really developed one method for workforce planning, And we were perhaps imposing too much that one method on different business problems, and that did not always work out so well. And I will speak about that a little bit later. But before that, what sort of experiences did you have, Jennifer?
Yeah, that's a really good example, Martin. I believe that a lot of us have done similar kind of organizational work at maybe a smaller scope company or organization. But it's clear that the strategy does uh, define the future workforce. And in this example, I'm going to give you now for a grocery retailer, this was before COVID-19. The strategy was to innovate and to become more innovative in its mobile apps for customers as well as its online apps. And in order to do that, they really needed to transform digitally their products. And not only that, but clearly that implied they needed to structure themselves a little bit differently, more fluid teams that would come together to develop aspects of products or features, and then be deployed to other teams to deploy other products and features. And DevOps environment, of course, that does change the roles as well. So, talent needed to have very good grasp and advanced knowledge of one discipline, but they also had to have an awareness and a knowledge of a second discipline to work successfully in that kind of environment. The roles, of course, then changed. The competencies, the kind of talent that the company was looking for resides at the Googles and the Ubers and the Lyfts and those types of organizations. So they have a very different market priced approach to rewards, and they motivate employees with bonuses and incentives. So this company that did not offer at lower levels in the organization incentives and equity needed to, of course, shore those components up, develop those components, and compete and know what the market was. Whereas before it was internally kind of leveling jobs and looking at internal salaries. So all of those changes really occurred when the strategy shifted. And that's what we're saying is that when there is a shift in strategy, that does help to define what the future workforce capability needs to be. So how do we get started on this journey, Martin?
So as I said before, I think it is really important that HR is involved early in the discussion. That allows really the HR leader to really develop an intimate understanding of where the business is going, what the business challenges are, and really an understanding of the business problem. Okay. And I think that is the key to then decide on what approach, what method you take around reimagining the workforce of the future. Okay. We talked about different types of problems and business problems already today. So, for example, the strategic shift and how that leads to thinking through your organizational design, your organizational capabilities, critical roles, critical competencies. But there can be other business problems. For example, it could be more a financial oriented business problem where it is about looking at productivity, looking at labor costs, looking at resource rebalancing. So it's a slightly different approach. The business problem could also be more HR oriented, more people oriented, a question of improving diversity, a question around addressing aging workforce, or dealing with specific retention issues that you may have in the organization. You might kind of look at this list and say to yourself, hey, we have all of those business problems and I want to fix all of them. And there, I think from my experience, it is important that you take one problem at a time. If you're trying to solve all those same problems at the same time, it drives a lot of complexity and it will be more complicated to make decision and then drive the right execution afterwards. So I think really here it is about working with the stakeholders to determine which is the most high priority business problem that we need to resolve, and then steer your approach towards that. That for me is the ultimate starting point to get started on that kind of journey.
Thank you, Martin. Well, we hope this was a useful exchange for our viewers and that you'll give us feedback and comments on LinkedIn. And stay tuned for the next in the 3-part series, where we'll go deeper on why you want to be a shaper of the future workforce with some tools and case studies. So goodbye and thank you.
Thanks a lot.